Okay, well, this is Unfragmented. We're inspired by Colossians 1, verses 16 and 17. For by him were all things created that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him. And he is before all things, and by him all things consist. And on Unfragmented as Book Club, we're developing a cohesive set of Christian thoughts for Christian action. Today is September 6th, 2023. I'm Kevin Novak. Of course, I'm joined by Lee Bortons, Michelle Nepp, Nicole Parks, and Jennifer Eck. And then, of course, we have Emma Bortons as our producer. Now, last month, just briefly, we talked about James Tooley's The Beautiful Tree. We learned that there is an apolitical, non-ideological conflict between the elite version of education forced on us and what we really want, which is education freedom. We also learned that education freedom is part and parcel to capitalism, that capitalism is how humans express, steward, and exchange the gifts that God has given to us. And then finally, we learned that education freedom relates to capitalism insofar as there is accountability between the buyer and the seller, that is, the parents and the teachers. And you go to Lee Borton's YouTube channel for the archive shows, and we encourage you to do that. This month, we are reading and talking about John R. Lott Jr.'s book, Freedomnomics, Why the Free Market Works and Other Half-Baked Theories Don't. Dr. Lott is joining us, and if you could, sir, I'll just give a brief introduction before we ask you some questions. Thank you for being here. Sure. Dr. Lott is an economist and a world-recognized expert on guns and crime. During the Trump administration, he served as the Senior Advisor for Research and Statistics in the Office of Justice Programs, and then the Office of Legal Policy in the U.S. Department of Justice. Dr. Lott has held research or teaching positions at the University of Chicago, Yale, the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, Stanford, UCLA, and Rice University. Dr. Lott was the chief economist at the United States Sentencing Commission during 1988 and 89. And he holds a PhD in economics from UCLA. And then finally, he founded the Crime Prevention Research Center. You can find that at crimeresearch.org. Dr. Lott, thank you for joining us, sir.
Oh, thanks for having me on. That's very nice of you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to Michelle. She's going to get our first question rolling here for you.
Good evening, Dr. Lott. I wanted to ask you, what is price control?
Well, price control is the government puts a limit on what prices can be. Either it puts a maximum price or a minimum price on it. And it makes it so that people aren't allowed to go and make trades that they want to make. And it creates either shortages or surpluses.
We just all started with chapter 1 this month, and you had talked about price control with regards to the gas shortages in the 1970s. And then you went on to talk about price controls in medicine around the world. And so would you give us a brief explanation how Americans are subsidizing medicine for the rest of the world?
Okay, well, what happens is different countries, Canada, for example, other countries will go to somebody who's making a particular drug, and they'll say, if you're going to be able to go and sell the drug in our country, this is the price that we're going to be willing to pay. And they'll pay something that will be, let's say, just above the price, the cost of them producing the product. So, you know, you may have spent hundreds of millions of dollars developing a drug and getting it through the approval process. But the cost of making each pill may be $1 or something like that. And so they'll say, we'll let you charge $1.10 or something. And if you don't agree to that, then we'll take away the patent that you have and give it to others so that others will be able to go and produce the drug then. And so the drug companies are faced with the situation. They're not, if all the countries, if everybody did that, then they wouldn't be able to recoup the hundreds of millions of dollars that they spent developing the drug that's there. But they've developed the drug, and the question is going forward, do they go and get the 5 cents on each dollar or lose complete control? I'll give you another example outside of drugs, and that is I write books. You're reading a book of mine here. My guess is the cost of printing up that book may be $3 or $4. We could go and just say we'll put a regulation there that the price of books can be, $3.50 or $4.50. And that would make books very cheap, much less expensive than they are now. The problem is that while that would cover the cost of printing up each book that you already have, you're not going to get any new books. Now, if we have lots of books out there, and maybe people think, boy, I have all the books I'm ever going to want. I don't need a new Harry Potter series. I already have the old one that's there, and we'll just reread those. And then in that case, that's what you'd get. You get cheap books, but you just wouldn't get any new ones because they wouldn't be able to recoup the author's cost of time to put it together, or the editors, or other types of things that they'd be doing for paying for the different people that help organize and put the book together before it gets sent to the printer. So, and the same is true with other drugs. So the Biden administration has this new law where, there are 10 drugs that they're going to negotiate on prices, and they're essentially going to do what these other countries are doing. These, what's going to begin to happen is the same thing that's happened with childhood vaccines, because we did something like that earlier under the Clinton administration. And that is, you have a situation where there are no new vaccines being developed. Well, if we don't need any more new vaccines for kids' diseases, we may be fine. But my guess is we're probably going to need something more in the future. And we've seen this, both types of administrations have done stuff like this. The Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, you may remember the anthrax scares and stuff that were there. Well, the government went in there and essentially confiscated at what they said was a fair price, which was essentially just the cost of making the vaccines there. And but then when the bird flu came around, nobody wanted to make the bird flu vaccines because they said, look, you just took our anthrax vaccines. We got all these costs here. We haven't already developed the bird flu vaccine. Maybe if they'd already developed it, then that would be one thing, but they hadn't developed it yet. So they didn't want to do it. Now, the one big difference that Trump did with COVID is because of those fears that the vaccine makers had, he essentially said, look, we guarantee you we'll buy the vaccines and we'll guarantee you the prices up front for these things. So we're not going to go and change the rules right after you develop it and take it from you after you've borne all these big costs to kind of quickly go and develop these vaccines. So anyway, it's if somebody's 85 years old, they may care about just getting cheap drugs, okay? But if somebody is young, you want to think, well, maybe there are other drugs that can be developed in the future, okay? Other diseases that are going to come up that I want people to have the incentives to go and produce. And the problem that you face right now is the rest of the world, they aren't covering the development costs for the drugs. They're just covering the cost of printing them up. American customers have been paying more for these things. In some sense, is that fair? No. But if you go and you eliminate it also in the United States, then these drug companies are just going to stop developing because they're not going to be recouping any of these costs. Now, one thing that happens sometimes is then the government gets involved and you have the government decide, okay, we'll provide X funding for development of this drug or this drug. But then you end up having a situation where essentially politics will determine what drugs are going to be developed. And also it's not as efficient because, they have other things taken into account in who they give the money to, like political favors or what have you, rather than just kind of having, purely profits. They're driving, whoever can get it, and they all try to get it, and whoever gets there first gets to have the profits on that patent that's there. They don't have political considerations. I mean, one just needs to see how the government gives out money for things like this environmental boondoggles that are out there right now that we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you brought up the COVID vaccine, because I know that with the COVID vaccine, it was pretty much fast-tracked through FDA. And my next question was going to be, how much do the Food and Drug Administration regulations interfere with the free market of developing these drugs and new drugs and new vaccines?
Yeah. Sure. I mean, it's a little bit outside my bailiwick, but I'm familiar with some of the work on there. You have people like Sam Peltzman and others who have done work on this. Milton Friedman's talked about this in the past, and others. And that is, it dramatically slows the development of drugs. You have a bureaucracy that worries that they get blamed if something goes wrong. If a drug gets released that might do some type of harm, they don't really get a benefit from releasing these drugs. And so, one could go and argue, and then there's been economists that have estimated this, that in fact, the number of people who are dying has increased as a result of the FDA, because it's dramatically slowed the development of new drugs. Now, maybe it prevented a couple things that might have caused problems from being released, yeah, but on net, it's also prevented a lot and slowed lots of drugs. So you can go and see how much did it slow the development of a drug that ended up being successful? How many people died over that period of time that might have been saved if the drug had been released earlier? And, and of course, private companies have an incentive to produce safe products. They have reputations. If you are a company and you produce a product that ends up killing somebody or harming them in other ways, then people aren't going to be willing to go and buy your product as much, and they're not going to be willing to pay higher prices for it. So
right.
So, hey, Michelle, can we let Jennifer ask her question? Because time's flying. You're so interesting, Mr. Lott. Thanks, Michelle. Go ahead, Jennifer. Ask your question.
Good evening, Dr. Lott. So the question I was hoping to ask you kind of comes from a educational perspective. I think a lot of our audience are homeschoolers, and as we're educating our own children, we don't always feel comfortable with every subject. For some people, it's math, and I think for a lot of people, it might be economics that's a little bit intimidating. And when you explain all this, you make it sound so easy, and it makes so much sense. But for those of us that are maybe a little intimidated by the subject, or don't feel like we really got an education on economics in our own education, where would you suggest that we start to make ourselves better educated so that we can bring up children who get this?
Right. Well, I think one excellent book is Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics. It's something that I'd probably recommend people go and get. But look, economics is really pretty simple. Two ideas that are there. One is just incentives and cost matters. If you make some things more costly, people do less of it. If the price of apples go up, people buy fewer apples. If the price goes down, people buy more. If you apply it to crime, if it's riskier for criminals to commit crime, if they face larger penalties, they'll do less crime. If the penalties go down, because you don't have as many police to arrest them, or you're not prosecuting, you're going to get more crime that's going to be occurring. So you apply that to lots of different areas there. Incentives matter. The more people make, the more they'll work. And then the other basic idea is how prices coordinate actions. So I don't need to know if I'm producing wood, I don't need to know what people are going to be building with the wood that's there. I don't need to know. I just need to know, did the price go up or down? If the price goes up, I'm going to want to go and plant more trees and harvest more wood that's going to be there. That's what I try to go and look at there. And I don't even need to specialize in that too much, because there are people out there who will be engaged in futures contracts who specialize in looking at that. So, there's lots of things about how prices coordinate. You look at some place like the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, whatever, where they set up these computer models to try to figure out how much of different things they should produce and where they should move different resources there. They never can do it because there's just so much information out there on things. So anyway, those are two basic ideas. In my book, Freedomnomics, I try to go through and just provide a lot of examples on this. Can I just stop for a minute? I want to go and tell somebody I was going to be doing something at the bottom of the hour and just see if I can spend a little bit more time with you guys. Can I?
Sure.
Can you get back on in a minute? All right.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, John. It's very kind of you.
Okay, let me see.
So while we're waiting for Dr. Lott to get back, when he's finished, if we could stay on and let me spend a few minutes talking to you about our Declaration of Educational Independence, finish off the time, unless he stays the whole 45 minutes, and I can talk to you another time about it.
That's very nice of him.
You asked good questions, Michelle.
Oh, so did Jennifer. I just love you guys.
I mean, he's on so many podcasts. It's got to get, I know when I was doing all those podcasts the last 4 months, it gets wearing.
Yeah, I just listened to him on the Tom Woods podcast. I saw his name pull up and I was like, oh, hey, that's kind of cool. Good.
Do you have a question for him? He's back. Can you ask the next question, Nicole?
Yeah, I can be a little longer than the bottom of the hour. So go ahead.
Good. Nicole's going to ask a question now.
All right. So my question was, when I was reading in chapter 1, you were talking about gas prices and how that can fluctuate due to something like a hurricane. And a lot of the things we hear now is that one reason for the gas prices, a big thing that we hear a lot in the media, is that it's due to the pipeline being shut down. So I kind of wanted to know what your thoughts or your analysis on that, maybe that correlation.
Okay, I'm not 100% sure. So, the thing with the hurricane is, people often talk about price gouging and speculators and things like that. That's going on. That's usually the conversation. And what people need to understand there is that those, quote, speculators are actually keeping the price from going up as much as it otherwise would have. So the reason why the gas prices start to rise before the hurricane hits is because people know that there's going to be less gas available after the hurricane because of supplies are going to be interrupted for some period of time afterwards. And so by raising the price before the hurricane, that allows them to save some gas that they can have available after it. So it's not going to go up as much after the hurricane hits. Now, as far as pipelines or whatever, if you have a pipeline, I assume you're talking about gets shut down or something for some period of time, right? You're talking about temporary shutdown of a pipeline?
I was kind of also thinking of the one that Biden shut down. I can't even remember what that pipeline, but that big pipeline.
Well, I mean, basically, the thing with Biden is he's been reducing supply in the future. And so how much I'm willing to pay for gas today is a function not only of supply and demand today, but what supply and demand tomorrow is going to be. And so if the price tomorrow is going to be higher because there's going to be less supply than I thought that there was going to be, just like with the hurricane, what markets do is they tend to equalize prices over time. So if I think the price next month is going to be higher than it was going to be otherwise, I'll take some of the gas that I have today and put it aside for when I could have sold it at a higher price. And I'll keep doing that until there's no difference in prices kind of once you've taken into account storage costs that's there for the gasoline. And so, if Biden goes there and he says, look, we're not going to allow any more drilling on federal land. We're not going to allow any more drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. That's reducing future supplies of gasoline. The price of gas in the future is going to be higher than it would have been otherwise. And that raises the price today. So people, you know, gas markets, everything else, they want to make money. And if I can go and take gas at a lower price and sell it at a higher price, I'm going to do that. And I'm going to keep doing that until I've kind of what they call arbitrage those price differences away. And they would normally do that across places more, but because of all the EPA regulations and stuff, it used to be much more uniformity of prices across the country than you have now, but we have different environmental rules that prevent people from shipping gas from one part of the country to the other. So, but that's basically, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. So my question for you is, you've been at this a long time. Your book's from 2007. You've written a number of books since, and you're super busy doing all this research with gun data. What is it that you wish the audience knew? What is it that you just can't shout to the rooftops enough about, let's say guns, since that's what you've been doing a lot of research on, or a different topic if you'd like?
Well, I mean, I guess there's so much there. You know, the thing to me that kind of just drives me nuts is how the media covers these issues. So if you want to take guns, for example, one of the things that drives a lot of the debate are these mass public shootings that we see. And one example is they'll go and they'll write about these manifestos that these mass murderers have, or their diaries, but they're extremely selective in what they pick. So, for example, you know, had things like the Nashville school shooter earlier this year in March. The Nashville police chief got to look at the manifesto before it was kind of turned over to the Biden administration. And he had a press conference where he said that that murderer had originally planned on attacking another place, but had decided not to go and do that because there was armed security and people with permitted concealed handguns there. So the murderer had picked the school because it looked like a soft target without that type of protection. You see the same thing with the Buffalo mass murderer last year. You know, he also had a manifesto. He wanted to get media coverage, and he knew the more people he killed, the more media coverage that he was going to get. And he knew if he went to a place where his victims were not able to have guns for protection, he was going to be more successful in killing more people and getting more media attention. You will search in vain for those cases or many others where they explicitly talk about why they pick the targets that they do, for the media mentioning why they picked those targets. You would think that's newsworthy. You would think it would be newsworthy. I mean, we're talking about how do we stop these attacks, and they want to go and talk about gun control and stuff like that that would have nothing to do with stopping the attacks. And yet they completely ignore what these murderers say themselves for why they picked the targets that they did. And you know, it just drives me crazy. I wish I could, you know, I go and I mention this, I go and do it on interviews and what have you. But you know, it's something that's the media generally completely ignores. And so, you know, and there are other things too. The media is, you know, just for example, is the United States unique in terms of mass public shootings? I mean, I can understand why the media gives a lot more coverage to an attack that occurs in the United States than in other countries. But, you know, they just don't make comparisons across other countries, even when they're doing perspectives on these things. So, you know, you take public school shootings. The United States since 2000 has had 10 mass public school shootings. A country like Germany's had 3. Well, the United States has 330 million people. Germany has 80 million. So we have more than 4 times the population. If you adjust the 3 times 4, that's the equivalent of 12. So that's a higher rate than we have. Finland has had 2 mass public school shootings. they have a population of like 5.5 million people. So you multiply their 2 by 60, that'd be the equivalent of having 120. Or Norway with 1, they have a population of just over 5 million too. I mean, that would be equivalent of like over 50. And so, it's not like most people, I live in Montana, most people wouldn't compare the number of murders in Montana with the number of murders in California. They would adjust it on a per capita rate that's there. So anyway, I could give you a whole semester class on things that I wish were out there that were covered, and but I assume you guys will have other questions you want to ask me. But I mean, it's just,
Well,
but you could see just one thing. I just mentioned this quickly, and that is, we're talking about gun stuff. All this to me is economics, because if you make something more costly, these people doing these attacks, they're going to do less of it. You have to know what they want to value. You have to figure out how to make it costly or difficult for them to do it. And it's no different than looking at crime generally on these things. Go ahead.
Well, Dr. Lott, I just wanted to ask you about younger people. I've seen Newt Gingrich on Fox a few times, and as much as I appreciate him, he thinks younger people and people now are going to be merely voting, at least next year, that is, because of their pocketbooks. And I don't know that that's true, especially with younger people. So I wanted to ask you about younger people. Assuming you engage younger people, come across younger people, maybe you go to conferences specifically for younger people. Are you seeing anything different about younger people? And obviously, specifically when it comes to economics, are they completely gone in terms of economics, conservative economics? Is there a renewal with conservative economics, and so on? I think he's on mute.
Dr. Lott, you muted.
Okay. I give talks at universities, and so I run into younger people in places like that. I run into younger people generally, and I have kids of my own. But I think overwhelmingly K through 12 and universities do a really poor job of educating people on lots of topics. I'm not even sure most econ classes these days do a particularly good job of doing it, because the way a lot of econ classes are taught are very mechanical stuff, solving for maximizing utility functions or other things. And I don't really think it helps people understand the world. I mean, the reason why, you look at my book, Freedomnomics, the questions you've had have just been on the first chapter so far. But, I try to apply it to lots of different types of problems that are there. To me, the whole reason why I became an economist was to go and kind of understand the world around me. I'm not sure a lot of economists do that. It's, in some sense, it's easier for a teacher to teach something that's very mechanical. And in some sense, it's easier for the students because they get kind of an easy answer on things. And they just set up the problem and they crunch through it in different ways, do the calculus, whatever that they have to do on it. And they solve it. But it doesn't stay with them, and it doesn't help kind of them understand the world that's around them. And so I think books like Sowell's Basic Economics, or I'd like to think my Freedomnomics book or whatever, gets those types of ideas and applies it to other areas of people's lives.
Okay, so before we let you go, can you tell us what you're doing right now and how we could reach you or help you? I know that you're not like a celebrity in the sense of taking a lot of questions from people, but you're always out there doing research and speaking to the same crowds we enjoy. So what is it you're up to, and what can we do to help you?
Well, thanks. Well, I mean, I run my organization, the Crime Prevention Research Center. We're a small group. We have like 6 employees. We have a budget of a few $100,000 a year that we spend. And you know, I used to, you know, if you read the Freedomnomics book, I guess it goes through about 45 of my academic papers that I've written over time. And so you get kind of at least somewhat of a view of the types of research that I've done over the decades. And I used to kind of spend 2 or 3 papers on an area and then move on to something else, because I'd be listening to the news and I'd say, is that right? Does that make sense to me? And then I would write a paper on it to try to figure it out. But since I've been running my center, I've been much more concentrated just purely on crime type issues. So we've looked at everything from policing to gun issues. One of the things that I've worked on recently, we just put out a report this last week, which kind of follows up on some stuff that I did when I was in the Department of Justice. We've gotten to the point where I don't think I can trust the data that comes out of the FBI, for example, on crime or some other things. I think they've really let politics interfere with the data. And okay. Sorry about that. And you know, it's just you know, so like just as an example of the types of problems there, there's something called the FBI's active shooting reports. These are reports that they put out yearly. Active shooting cases are instances where guns fired in public. It could not part of some other type of crime like a robbery or a gang fight over drug turf. It encompasses anything from one shot being fired and nobody hit, all the way up to a mass public shooting. Over the 9 years from 2014 through 2022, the FBI claims that there are 302 of these active shooting cases. They claim that 14 of them involved or were stopped by citizens with concealed handgun permits. The problem that I find is they just missed lots and lots of cases. And I pointed this out when I was working at the Department of Justice, because one of the tasks I had was to go and look at their reports. And they're not interested in fixing it. So rather than 302 cases and 14 being stopped, I think it's actually about 157 cases where armed civilians have stopped these active shooting cases. Some of them, almost all those are cases that they missed, but also there's some that they mischaracterized as security guards rather than armed civilians. And so rather than about 4.6%, close to about 40% of these attacks were actually stopped by armed civilians. You know, it's one thing to miss cases. They spent millions of dollars trying to go and look at news searches to put these things together. I was able to get these cases with just a few $1,000s being spent. So I don't make a claim that I found all the cases that they're missing, but there's a lot. And when I was at the Department of Justice, I also made the argument that they needed to separate out places where people were allowed to carry versus ones where they weren't allowed to carry. And these so-called gun-free zones, we're talking about law-abiding citizens stopping these attacks, and you can't expect them to stop attacks in places where they're not allowed to carry. And when you do that, it's actually in 2022, over 60% of these active shooting cases were stopped by armed civilians. So again, it's one thing, people can make mistakes, they can miss things, though there's a lot of these cases that they've missed, almost so many of them, it's almost hard to believe that they missed all these cases by accident. But even if it was by accident, if somebody points out to you, look, you've missed these cases, you should go and correct your record here. And they just refuse to go back and fix them. And Even the Washington Post fact checker, Glenn Kessler, earlier this year reached out to the FBI, asked for comment, and they refused to talk to him about it. He went and talked to the group that they paid literally millions of dollars to put this together. And of the 127 or so cases I had listed at the time, they came back with 2 of them that they said didn't fit. One was a shooting at a dentist's office where a husband had gone into where his wife was working, tried to start shooting up a place where a concealed carry permit holder stopped it. And they said, well, we didn't include this because it was a domestic dispute. But the thing is, I can give you 14 of the cases that they did include that were clearly the same type of domestic disputes. The only difference between the ones that they included and the one that I found was that the one I found was stopped by a concealed carry permit holder. And there's one other example that they have there that I could go through that's similar. And it's just, look, guys, you know, if you're going to do this, at least be consistent in how you're going to be doing these types of things. But I think we're in a world now, unfortunately, where a lot of people there just aren't interested in trying to get the data accurate, that they're more interested. I mean, obviously, a lot of people have talked about the politicization of the FBI, the politicization of the Department of Justice. And I can't speak broadly for the FBI. The only people I really had much to deal with were the data people that were there. But on a number of issues, the data people that I worked with seemed very political. And it was very concerning, and it makes it, I'm just giving you one example with regard to the active shooting cases, but it, you know, the thing is, I don't know how we can debate these things if we, you know, crime going up or whatever, if we can't trust the crime data that's being put out. If we can't, you know, I don't know how we can even debate solutions for these things if we can't trust the basic data that these debates are going to be focused on. And of course, it not just affects the media coverage, it affects court cases, it affects other things that are there too, and it's very troubling. So that's one thing I've just finished working on. I got other
I'm glad
projects.
you're working on it. It's just really important, and I'm sorry that the truth can't get out there. I want to leave with a little bit of hope. I don't know if you know anything about Classical Conversations, but we represent over 50,000 families, 130,000 children who are working together in a specific curriculum, and I'm the developer of it. And the majority of our high school program is based on free market economics. So whether it's the literature we read, the original government documents we read, the economics we study, and of course, lots of good math and science to learn how to back it all up. So there's 50,000 families that are trying to help you out, John, and I hope
Okay, well,
that,
that's great. Well, one other book, economics book I'd recommend is Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. That's
we just did that for a book club in what, January or February?
Okay,
Yeah.
that's a very good book. And
Yes, very good.
Milton Friedman's Free to Choose is pretty good too. So those are all good books on economics. But anyway.
Well, I think yours is exceptional because of how you tell the stories and how you make it all approachable. So we're really looking forward to talking about it during the next 3 weeks. So our time's up, but thank you so much for joining us and giving us the full 40 minutes. It was wonderful of you to be here.
Okay, well, thanks. And I've written 10 books. My Freedomnomics book is my favorite of the books. I probably would have picked a different title than they did, but I didn't have much control over that. You know, it's probably my favorite just because it touches so many different topics, and it kind of summarizes a lot of the research that I've done over the years. And but anyway, I really appreciate it. So thank you very much for your time. And if you guys have other questions, you can email me. Our website is crimeresearch.org, and I have my contact information there at crimeresearch.org. And if you have questions, I'm happy to try to answer. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.